Let's talk about ink, specifically ink the resource slash cost, not ink the color. I plan to talk about ink colors in their own video, preferably once we've seen more of the first chapter. So ink is the resource you use to pay for the costs of cards and the costs of some abilities. You get ink by surrendering cards from your hand, up to once per turn, provided those cards are inkable, and we'll get into that a little later. Ink is a renewable resource. Any ink you exert to pay for stuff this turn will be readied at the start of your next turn to be used again. Very handy. The main question that you'll be faced with during an actual game is, what do I ink? Now, it's unfortunately not an exact science, but I think there's some guidance that can be given here. Looking at the cards in your hand, you need to ask yourself, what can I play this turn? What can I play next turn? Which of these cards will I be able to play before the game ends? Now, if you're on your first turn, ideally you'll have something that costs 1 ink to play, particularly given Lorcana's generous mulligan system. Let's say you also have in your hand Maleficent Monstrous Dragon, which costs a whopping 9 ink. It is fully possible that the game will end before you reach 9 ink, especially if you can get questing early with your 1-drop. So the 9-drop is a perfect target to ink on your first turn. Now you may be saying futilely to your computer screen, "But Wero, I put Mal in my deck because I wanted to play her." And my answer to that is, well, you gotta ink something. Better to ink something you're less likely to play in the next couple turns. And even if you do make it to 9 ink, by that time you'll have drawn more cards, and maybe you'll have drawn into another copy. That's one reason why it's usually a good idea to run 4 copies of each card. As the turns progress, you might be tempted to keep inking those high-cost cards, but as the game goes on longer, it will start being decided by more powerful cards. You almost never want to ink your last copy of a card. As your ink hits 4 or 5, you want to start inking 1 and 2 drops instead. Cheap cards are most valuable early game, with some exceptions, such as if you're trying to pull off a Stitch Rockstar draw engine. As your ink increases, you'll want to start hanging on to those higher cost cards instead of inking them, but you still need to keep inking things if you want to reach that cost threshold, and as the game goes on, your hand is going to get smaller and smaller, especially if you're inking and playing a card every turn. If you do that, then you'll have fully exhausted your hand when you have 6 ink if you're going first and 7 ink if you're going second. By that point, unless you have sources of draw beyond your 1 per turn, you will fully be top decking. So if you're going to include a card that costs 7 or more ink, it'd either better be a very good card that immediately affects the board state, or you need to have either extra draw or ink ramping in your deck. Otherwise, each turn you will be faced with a decision. Do I ink the card I just drew or play it? If all you do on a turn is ink a card, you're only helping your opponent. You want to be playing a card each and every turn. So as a general guideline, you want to ink high-cost cards early game and low-cost cards mid and late game, but you'll probably want to stop inking at some point, usually around 6 or 7 ink, unless your deck has very expensive cards. But it all depends on the circumstances. If your hand is 6 1 and 2 drops and an 8-drop, you're probably fine inking a 1-drop and saving your big card. If you need to, you can always ink it later, and if you don't need to, you'll still have it. But probably the best way to decide what to ink is to have a plan. Looking at your hand, what are you playing this turn, next turn, and the turn after that? In your opening hand, do you have a 1-drop, a 2-drop, and a 3-drop? Once you know what you want to play, start thinking about what you can ink. You want to ink something you're not planning to play in the first few turns, whether that's a 9-drop you may never get to play, or an extra 1-drop that just doesn't fit into your current plan. In the mid-game, this can lead to some tough choices. Let's say you're at 4 ink and you have Mulan Imperial Soldier and Beast Hard-Headed in your hand and nothing else inkable. If you want to play one of them, you're going to have to ink the other, so you have to decide which one is most useful to you right now, or at least which will give you more value in the long run. If your opponent has a powerful item, probably you ink Mulan, but if you've got a large board that would benefit from her, maybe you ink Beast. Knowing which to pick in such instances is something that will come from experience. Now, some cards you should almost never ink, cards that you know you always want to play. Removal is a big one. You want the majority of your deck to be characters, so you can't run too much removal in the first place, so what little you do have you want to use for its intended purpose. Card draw, you should also hesitate to ink, as it's how you get more cards, which you can then decide to ink or play in turn. Whatever card you're trying to play by inking removal or card draw better be pretty damn good. Something that can help with these decisions is building your deck properly in the first place. Firstly, you need to think about your ink curve, that is, the cost makeup of your deck. Generally, you'll want a deck with a few 1-drops, maybe a few expensive cards, and most of it being 2 to 4 cost cards. This creates a bell-ish curve when lined up by cost, hence the name. Where the curve peaks depends on what kind of deck you're building. In an aggressive deck that wants to fill the board as quickly as possible, you probably want a peak at 1 ink with nothing that costs more than 3 or 4 ink. In a ramping deck that is trying to get out big threats as quickly as possible, your peak will probably trend more toward the expensive. But an average deck, what is often called mid-range, will have a peak around 2.5-ish. The reason for doing this is you want to have a card to play every turn. If your hand is full of high-cost cards and all you're doing every turn is inking one of them and passing, your opponent is going to steamroll you if they're actually putting characters into play and questing. This is a principle called tempo. You want to be able to play on curve, getting out a 1-drop on turn 1, a 2-drop on turn 2, a 3-drop on turn 3, and so on. A deck running lots of expensive cards needs either a good ramp package or a good draw package, preferably both. This is also why on those early turns you want to be inking expensive cards and playing cheap cards, because the other way around you're only inking and doing nothing else. Remember, you win the game by questing, and you can only do that with characters in play. Another thing to consider is Inkability. If your entire deck has fancy flourishes, you don't need to worry about this. But there are quite a few good cards that just aren't inkable. Fire the Cannons, Dragonfire, Genie on the Job. Adding such cards to your deck will likely increase your chances of winning, but you don't want to add too many. The more uninkable cards are in your deck, the likelier it is you reach a point where you can't ink anything and then you're stuck. In other games, this is called mana screw and is often viewed as just part of the luck of the draw. But in Lorcana, you decide your odds of ink screw, and I would be very cautious adding more than 10 total uninkable cards to a deck. In other words, 2 or 3 unique cards with up to 4 copies each. Speaking of copies, the main reason you want to run 4 copies of each card is consistency. You're running a card on your deck for a reason, so you want your highest possible odds in drawing it. If it's a card you only really need 1 copy of and it's inkable, then there's basically no downside, as any extra copies you don't need you can just ink. If it isn't inkable, well, maybe you only run 2 or 3 copies, but the best decks are consistent decks, and consistent decks run 4 copies of each card. Hopefully that makes things a bit clearer. Plan what you're going to play, ink what you aren't, and build your deck in the first place to make these decisions easier for yourself.